Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 17. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
McKinney and Jason McKinney.
Huh?
It was like the James Bond. James Bond.
Yeah, we can go with that. I'll run that on this one. You always just say, hey guys.
Exactly. I always thought, hey guys, but this is like a good McKinney. Jason McKinney.
I'll let it slide this one time. Yeah, and we'll see how it takes. So tonight we're diving into the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. And before we jump into this, I first want to announce that our October schedule is going to be a little bit different than what we've done up until this point. Up until this point, we've tried to do an episode every 2 weeks. Our game plan for October is to do one episode a week through the month of October. We're going to do our absolute best. I've already started coming up with ideas and writing those episodes so that we can do that. It's hard enough to do one every 2 weeks, but I think we can do it. We just want to have a fun Halloween themed month. And I think we're going to call it October Spooktacular. I'm not really sure yet. We're still trying to figure out names, but we're going to do one episode a week the month of October. And we're saying that right now because this will be our last paranormal episode before the month of October. And so when our next ghost episode comes around, we'll be in our Spooktacular.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be really difficult for me. I mean, I have to hear an extra story every week. Oh, man, I'm not sure if I can handle this.
Yep, your workload's going to double, Jason, from listening to one episode every 2 weeks to listening to two episodes every week or whatever it is.
People that like come up with these ideas and stuff, and how hard it is for you to come up with all of this information for us. And my only responsibility is to sit here and listen.
Yeah, it definitely can get tough doing all the research, but it's a blast. I enjoy it. What's really hard sometimes, and Jason and I were talking about this before we started recording, is that sometimes some of this information is hard to come by. You know, you have places like this asylum that have stood for 150 years, and the stories become bigger and bigger, and then sources point to other sources that point to other sources that don't actually get down to the bones of the story. So you kind of have to dig a little bit. But all that said, I think, we've done a pretty good job of putting together these episodes up until this point, and that's our game plan to do that. And then, of course, in October to do one a week. So if you're a fan of the show, I mean, October is going to be tough for us, but hopefully fun for you guys.
Yeah, man. And I think that the other interesting thing about all this is not only like the story that comes along with these places that are very old, but also the history, like the deep history that runs along with it, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So all that said, Jason, are you ready?
I am.
Okay, here we go. Standing in the dark hallway of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum with a feeling of unease, a child's voice, joyful, can be heard in the distance. It may sound pleasant or welcoming, but it's 2 a.m. and you're alone. Deeper into the asylum, a feeling of unease or dread creeps over you. When you notice two shadows approaching you from down the hall, then a soft voice, scared, almost right in your ear, issues a warning. Run.
Man, I know I say this all the time, but it just gives me chills thinking about the way your cold openings start. Part of me, every time you do a cold open on these ghost stories, like the hair on the back of my arms is standing straight up. Nope, I am done. Especially with kids, man. Like I think everyone agrees that when you add a kid into the story, it gets much creepier.
Yeah, dead kids are never fun for anybody, I don't think, but it definitely adds a level of scariness when you have kids laughing and playing at 2 in the morning.
Yeah, I remember my mom. She would always freak out when I would come into her room and like wake her up in the middle of the night because I was scared or something. And I was always used to think, why are you freaking out? Like I'm just coming in and waking you up. Like I'd always try so hard not to scare her. and just like gently wake her up. But she'd always freak out. And now, like being 30 years old, I'm like, I could understand that if a kid was waking me up at 12 a.m. in the morning, I might jump a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely unsettling when you wake up and there's a little girl standing an inch from your face saying "Dad." I've had plenty of moments like that. Okay, so tonight we're talking about the ghosts of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. And we'll first start, on the history of the asylum like we always do, and then we'll talk about the ghosts that roam the facility. So the interesting thing is that the asylum sits near the West Fork River in West Virginia. So, as with all buildings or haunted things we've discussed on this podcast, there's a time before the asylum. And in this part of West Virginia, it was the Iroquois Indians who lived here. The Shawnee and the Delaware would often come and fish and hunt here, but they would always go back to their villages, either up north or in Ohio. And you might think, well, why would they do this? Why wouldn't they just stay in this part of West Virginia? Well, the Shawnee believed that there were mysterious monsters and evil spirits that lived here. They wouldn't stay for extended periods of time in what's now referred to as Appalachia. So, as always, why not build something where the Native Americans have already decided we shouldn't build something?
There's so much truth to this. I feel like every time we start a story out with like a haunted building, it's somewhere where Indians have said, "Hey, there is like ghosts here. You probably shouldn't do it," you know?
Yeah, they always pick the areas where the Native Americans ahead of time said, this is a bad area. And then, the white man shows up and is like, oh, let's build a hospital here. Let's build a prison here. And then it's just like ghosts.
And then we wonder why it's haunted.
Yeah. Why is this so horribly haunted? Huh. So after this area was settled and people kept moving west, there arose a need for a special hospital, one that took care of what people called at the time the insane. The construction of the asylum has some really interesting history. So it started construction in 1858 using prison labor and blue sandstone from a quarry in Mount Clair. So there was a board put in place to select an architect, building advisors, all that. So Francis T. Striblin and Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, along with architect Richard Snowden Andrews. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride was renowned at this time for building mental hospitals. And so what's known as the Kirkbride Plan was a building structured around lots of natural light and air circulation. Typically, it was built on sprawling open land. The building was built with long wings staggered in like an echelon formation, and think geese flying in a triangle, but with building wings. The idea was that patients had rooms that had lots of natural light, as well as lots of air circulation, while still keeping their privacy. The Kirkbride Plan was used here, and this facility is actually the largest hand-cut stone building in North America, second only to the Kremlin. And what's really interesting is as I was going through and looking at all the different sources and trying to figure things out, there was some commentary on stone structures and how, I don't know how, this is just very woo-woo, but supposedly stone structures tend to trap ghosts. It's kind of like how mirrors in houses, when someone dies, they get trapped in the mirror. They can't find their way out. Supposedly stone structures do that same thing. They capture people's spirits and you get stuck and you can't penetrate the stone for whatever reason.
Interesting. I mean, I guess it is Earth. I mean, that's built into the walls.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So just keep that in mind here, because supposedly, since it's the second largest hand-cut stone building in the world, you're going to have a lot of ghosts stuck here. So if you know your history, Civil War breaks out. They're currently building this hospital in Virginia. Of course, when the war broke out, Virginia splits and becomes West Virginia and Virginia. One goes Confederate, the other stays with the Union. And so what ends up happening is, where the hospital is being built, it's on the side of land that becomes West Virginia. Everything kind of comes to a grinding halt. And the money that was set aside for the building of the hospital basically becomes war effort money. But very quickly, the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry comes in and seizes those funds before they can be used for the war effort. And it goes back to Virginia, and it becomes kind of like a startup treasury. And then eventually some of those dollars make their way back to the construction of the asylum in 1862. So there was like a brief pause, exchange of hands, Civil War is going on, and the money begins to flow back again in 1862. They begin building this hospital again. So the asylum saw both Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. And it was really interesting because at this time, They had like military supplies, building supplies at this building. And so the Confederates, they'd come in and they'd raid the building and steal stuff and take things, and they'd fight. We had a lot of Civil War activity, some actual combat that happened, and some raids that happened on the building. Finally, after all this was going on, and West Virginia became part of the Union, 1864, the asylum starts seeing patients. Some time passes, and they finish construction in 1881.
Wow. So this kind of makes me think of like the Patriot. You ever seen that movie?
Oh, yeah.
Where like, the building is, it's like their house, where their house kind of just gets thrown in disarray because there's a war right outside the front of their house, and it just kind of gets fought over.
They just basically lose their farmhouse. That happened in the Revolution, but it also happened in the Civil War. It was different in the Revolution, and that's why we have our amendments to the Constitution. There's a little bit of a difference there, but yeah, the fighting is going on right outside the door. In the Revolution, of course, it was the British soldiers forcing people that lived in those homes to house their soldiers, and that's why we have the Third Amendment, right? That keeps the average citizen from being forced to house soldiers. In this specific case, it was already a government state building, so it was already being used by the state. So housing Civil War soldiers kind of made sense. But you're right, it was happening right outside their door, and it just got basically pulled up into the war effort. There's very few times in American history where we have landmarks or state-owned buildings that ended up actually being used for a war effort, because we've only had so many wars fought on our soil. We're kind of getting in the weeds here. Let's get back to our episode.
Sorry, I just like pictured Patriot like while you're talking about all this stuff.
You just saw Mel Gibson like running through the woods shooting people. I get it. Yeah. Who doesn't love bloody Mel Gibson fighting and killing the British? That's always a blast. If you listen to our episodes, typically this is how it goes. We like to talk about the history of the location, because a lot of times what happens is that it just adds a lot more color to the story. And when you look back at the history, sometimes you can pull out pieces of history in the story itself. Some of these ghosts actually show back up. We end up seeing Civil War ghosts later on. So with most hospitals or reformatories that we've talked about in the past, they very quickly turn into problems. All good things eventually come to an end. And just like the reformatory that we talked about in the past, all of a sudden we had overcrowding. So originally the place was intended to hold about 250 patients, but with only like 15 years, the number crept up to like 700. And then after that, incrementally, it ends up getting up to like 2,000 or 3,000 patients, all crammed into this hospital that was supposed to only hold 250 patients. That happens all the time. It happened at the Ohio State Reformatory, like we talked about last time. Just overcrowding eventually ruins the original purpose of these facilities. And because of that, what ends up happening is a lot of illness spreads quickly, patients get neglected, and we end up with misery in one location. And when we get a lot of misery in one location, we end up with ghosts. So the intake documents for these patients at this time, they get pretty wild. And they use a lot of like broad catch-all terms like seduction, egotism, acute mania, jealousy, and some other like really weird ones. But all that said, more patients were being thrown at this facility day by day, and it quickly became a huge issue. And I saw somewhere where they were saying, like, if you had a family member, you could just basically drop them off at this asylum and they would just become a patient. And it seemed like some of these patients weren't actually in need of mental health help. They just were thrown at this facility.
So what you're saying is if you have a crazy child or a crazy wife or crazy husband, you could just take them to this facility and say, here you go.
Pretty much. Yeah, that's kind of how this ended up happening. And then what was really sad was, since it was so overcrowded, there's so many stories of patients that would end up at this asylum only to die of pneumonia a few weeks later, or in some cases, quote unquote, dying in a fit, which I think just means, I don't know what that means, but dying in a fit. There's just a lot of catch-all terms that were used to describe patients coming in that probably shouldn't have been there, and the patients dying in weird ways, and they just added random terms to them. They really just weren't equipped at all to handle the amount of patients that they had.
I mean, you go from 250 patients to handling 2,000. That just, it kind of sounds like the ER at your local city hospital.
Yeah, just too many patients for the beds that you have, essentially. So because of this, they had a ton of patients, and they were trying to find ways to mitigate some of the craziness that was happening at these hospitals. And so what you end up getting are like really extremely barbaric forms of treatments, at least according to our standards today. And so we're going to talk about a few of those here in a second. And I want to give a quick warning right now. We're not going to go through anything like too crazy. We try not to do that with our podcast. We're not trying to like have some kind of gross like shock effect. We're trying to stick to a pure enough history, and so we'll do that. But if you're kind of squeamish, we do talk about some of this stuff, but it really doesn't get too bad. So kind of listen at your own discretion. So one of the sources I read for this episode is a book, The Haunted History of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum by Sherri. And in this book, there's a section on common psychotherapy practices from this era in which the asylum ran. So she doesn't make any claims that these took place here, but nonetheless, it's important to talk about them because they were common practices at the time that this hospital ran. And so they probably most likely did take place here. And I'm not going to go through all of them because some of them were pretty like jarring and there wasn't really a whole lot of evidence that they actually took place. But we are going to talk about the ones that were most common and probably actually did take place here. The first of these is confinement. And we're all well aware of like the image of like a crazy person in a straitjacket, where every movie you've seen it. Hannibal Lecter, he's in a straitjacket, he's on a dolly, his face is like he's got a mask on, and that was pretty common because when you have a ton of patients, especially ones that can get violent, you got to find ways to control them. One of these practices that were used was called the Utica crib. It's basically this like coffin-sized box where they would stick patients in that were deemed to be violent or crazy or too much, I don't know, dangerous to the staff. And they essentially had a lid, they lock them in, and they would just be in these boxes confined to almost like a coffin. Some of them were made of like cast iron rods, and they were just completely inhumane. And so in Brake's book, she has a picture of one of these cribs that was used at the Columbus Asylum, but pretty messed up that these guys that had clearly mental problems were shoved in these boxes and just locked probably overnight or for days at a time, and essentially just tortured in a way. If you think about how horrible that would be to be locked in a coffin for hours on end.
I don't know about you, but that's like one of my worst nightmares. Just to be locked in a box and not be allowed to really eat or, talk to anybody. I mean, you're just, especially if you're already insane, you're already hearing voices to begin with. Now you're locked in a box hearing only those voices.
Yeah, it would explain the vast amount of deaths that happened here. I can't imagine the pain and suffering that took place, but that's how you end up getting so many tormented spirits.
Yeah, you got to wonder about like some of these soldiers that went to war and got PTSD. All they see or hear is the bombs and the gunshots, and they're just going crazy about just those things. And now they get locked up in a box until, I mean, probably most cases till the day they die, just because they're like ready to defend themselves.
Yeah, and there were plenty of wars that took place while this hospital was in use, and a lot of the early patients were coming from, and the intake documents had war on there as reasons they were there. Of course, at the time, they didn't have the proper terms or vocabulary for it. We know it now as PTSD. Just think about this hospital ran during the Civil War, the Spanish American War. You had World War I, World War II. All those took place in the span of this hospital existing, and maybe even Korea and Vietnam. I think this hospital ran until like the late 1900s, 1990 or so, 1994, I think. So the next thing I want to talk about, which I never actually heard of this before, was insulin shock therapy. So this doctor, Manfred Sackel, he accidentally overdosed one of his patients that was diabetic with insulin, and she slips into a coma. She wakes up, and miraculously, she no longer is addicted to morphine. He's like, huh, that's really interesting. And then it happens again. He accidentally overdoses another patient, and then that patient wakes up and is also no longer addicted to morphine. And he's like, I think I just discovered some kind of cure. And so they end up deciding that if we overdose patients on insulin, they go into comas. And when they come out, they basically you hit the reset button on these guys. And so they did this for a little while, and they often aimed for like a 1 hour to 4 hour coma. And they did this up until the 1960s. And they decided, okay, too many patients are dying from this treatment. We got to stop doing this. We got to stop overdosing patients on insulin. But it just goes to show you the craziness or the chaos of mental health up until not that long ago. You had patients that would just be essentially tortured. They're forcing people into comas with insulin to treat psychosis or to treat mania, and that most likely took place here at this institution. So imagine that you're already having patients, you already have a high death toll at this hospital. You start patients on insulin, they go into comas, and then they die from that as well. These providers, I'll use that loosely. These physicians or scientists were just basically testing these theories on these patients because no one cared about these patients once they were at the hospital. At their hospital, they were essentially just like guinea pigs to try out all these things. And there was so little known about the brain that it's kind of like, if it works, let's do it.
Oh my gosh, this is like, you know, they're dying of DKA. Let's just go ahead and send everybody and anybody to into DKA and hope that they survive it.
Yeah, it's bad. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. That's the history of this location. These patients that were already suffering from mental health was so underserved at this time. And you had these doctors, scientists, just like, we'll figure it out. And that's what they did. And they just tried things.
So this is like, you know, you have somebody that comes into the hospital with an addiction. And like especially like morphine, alcohol, those kind of addictions are really hard to break on somebody because like those patients, if they're really addicted to those things, they end up coming into the ICU needing special medications to help control them just to make sure they survive coming out of these addictions. And then you add DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, on top of that medical emergency. It's like, let's add 2 medical emergencies together and pray to God that they come out of it alive.
Yeah, it's fighting fire with fire.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is, and it's kinda funny to watch, like, you're just kinda hoping and praying that, "Hey, let's hope it rewires their brain." In reality, you're just hoping that they survive one addiction and not addiction, but the next medical emergency. Then you're hoping they survive the next.
I guess it seems like it's working. You put these patients in insulin induced comas, and if they survive it, they come out on the other side like, I'm refreshed or whatever. But that's, yeah, a very dangerous concoction of, you're fighting fire with fire. So to build on that further, let's talk about the last two therapies. And these were more broadly used. These two were used frequently, and in some cases, they're used still today. And so, of course, I'm talking about shock therapy and lobotomies. So the Travel Channel, they have this like video of these two hosts that are basically doing a ghost hunt with a psychic. And their show is called Inside Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum Portals to Hell. That's the name of the episode. It'll be in the show notes. You can look at it. It's like an 8-minute clip. I watched it while I was doing my research for this, and I'm pulling from that a little bit because they basically claim that there were thousands of these transorbital lobotomies performed here at this asylum. Elsewhere, that the numbers I saw were closer to like 100, a couple hundred or something. They claimed that there were multiple thousands. They actually went and talked to people that work there, so maybe there's some truth to that. In Brake's book, I think she numbers just the number she comes up with is closer to 100, but she also doesn't cover the entire history of the hospital. So just kind of keep that in mind. Supposedly, thousands of these were performed here at the asylum. Some successful, others, of course, not so much. The transorbital lobotomy, it was actually popularized by Walter Freeman in the US, based off some research and procedures by Antonio Moniz and Pedro Lima. I apologize if I got those names wrong. They're from Spain. I don't speak Spanish. So I did my best. Antonio Moniz and Pedro Lima. So the neurosurgeons in the US, they actually pushed back against this procedure, and they didn't think it was worth the risk that was there. The problem was Freeman was performing these, and the media, it was like this media sensation. And so like it gained all this traction. He just was able to push past the pushback from the neurosurgeons, essentially. And most famously, Freeman performs this procedure on JFK's sister, Rosemary, basically leaving her severely impaired physically and mentally. And that's a very famous lobotomy that happened where she went from, I don't even think she was like manic or anything. I think she was just mildly eccentric. They did this lobotomy and basically just turned her into a vegetable. This was happening a lot at this time. And so what was called Operation Ice Pick by the media was a tour in 1952 in which Freeman, he performs like 3,000 of these procedures. He takes this ice pick, he inserts it above the eye, just under the eyelid, in an attempt to disrupt the prefrontal cortex. And from my understanding, they stick it in there, they wiggle it around, and they try to break free the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. In some cases, it scrambles the brain so badly that patients just become vegetables. In other cases, they had some success. So the actual ablation process of removing pieces of the brain that are quote unquote malfunctioned has shown some success, but the way that it was being performed, Freeman was doing these in like 10 minutes. He would stick the ice pick in their eye and just kind of wiggle around and do this procedure very quickly and eccentrically and aggressively, and was causing patients either to survive and be vegetables, survive and be a little bit normal, or maybe they became really docile. A lot of patients passed away. It was just very rough, and a ton of these happened at the asylum. So you imagine what was going on here. You almost had quote unquote therapy, but in reality, you're looking at torture in a way. It was extremely barbaric.
Yeah, every time I watch like a video of this or hear about it, it ends up with a ghost story following close behind.
Yeah. Here's what's really tough about mental health. It's so young in medicine. People don't know a lot about it. The brain is very complicated. So these procedures are very barbaric. There is some, I guess, a little bit of a leg to stand on in some cases. And so when it's popularized in media, it becomes very like, okay, we have these guys, we're gonna like lobotomize them, and they become like violent criminals, or like the electroconvulsive therapy, where you see it as this like torture device, and in some cases it really was, but in some cases it works really well. It's hard because they were kind of onto something back then, but they just didn't have the technology to do it in a way that was what we would consider modern medicine, and they messed up a lot of people, and a lot of people were essentially tortured in the guise of medicine, practicing medicine. So the last procedure I want to talk about is electroconvulsive therapy, essentially running an electric current through the brain, causing brief seizures. This seemed to kind of reset things, reversing symptoms of a lot of the mental disorders, like such as schizophrenia. And it's actually still used today. It's much more refined and controlled. Back then, however, it was used and abused. These patients were subject to high levels of electricity, and also way more frequently than they should be. It was almost used in a way by these doctors or nurses or whatever they were as a punishment, as opposed to an actual treatment.
So yeah, thinking about TV shows, I always thought this electrical therapy was like a sign of torture. And then I did class on psych, and it turns out that this is actually a great way to cure depression. I never thought of that way of shocking the brain was a way to cure depression. But we actually had I actually got to watch a patient that was in a nursing home. She got this electrical therapy to cure her depression, and it helped a lot. And while we were sitting in the waiting room to watch her go through this procedure, like other people that I had talked to in the waiting room said, "Yeah, this actually really works. Like this, it's almost like an instant cure. When they come out of this, they feel really less depressed." They watch their vital signs. They obviously make sure that the patient is sedated to make sure that they're not experiencing any pain during this whole procedure. And it's awesome to see these patients come out of it, and they look. I mean, she looked like she felt better too.
Yeah, it's very interesting because ECT, I mean, it's used today. A lot of times it's chemically induced, but today they even still use electroconvulsive therapy with electrodes. It's more refined today, so it's not as violent or as scary as the way it was used previously. And it's funny because these physicians that do use it and they have a lot of success with it. And it's again different than back then. Back then it seemed like it was intentionally used as like a punishment, whereas today it's used in like a very controlled manner, and they have, like you said, some pretty incredible results.
Yeah, it was kind of weird though, because you actually see, like, you know how in the movies they grab the two handheld probes and they put them next to the head to like shock the brain. Like, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the paddles where they're like torturing them. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what it looks like. You're like, oh man, this is gonna hurt them. Like, why are you doing this to them? But then, like, you don't hardly see the body like get zapped. Like, you don't see them jump or anything. You just, all right, you ready? Yep, we're ready. All right. And then they do it, and the patient wakes up, and they're like, yeah, I didn't really feel anything. I feel fine. I feel pretty good.
yeah, it's pretty incredible. It's way more refined and shockingly used more frequently than you think. So that was a history of like the therapies and the ways that these patients were quote unquote treated. And I want to jump over to tuberculosis really quickly before we get anywhere else. We talked about the history, we talked about the therapies that some of these patients suffered through. And before we get into ghosts, let's talk TB because TB was a huge issue in this era and a ton of patients died from tuberculosis. It spread like wildfire through facilities like this. And you had a 50% survival rate. When you got this, it was a coin toss. You could either be alive or you could be dying in a few weeks. And it got so bad at this asylum that they ended up receiving some funds to build a separate building where patients could be quarantined with TB. So Brake's book, The Haunted History of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, it lists something like 250 patients that died of this disease. And I don't know the exact number because the book didn't give a number. It just listed every single name and it went across like several pages. So I just kind of like averaged it out. But it was something like 250 patients that died of TB at this facility. And all these patients, they're buried on site in unmarked graves, which is just crazy. Imagine that many people dying in poor conditions of a wasting, or, they called it the White Death or the wasting disease or whatever, or they also called it consumption. And then they're just buried on site at the hospital.
Yeah, that's scary. This is where like all the ghost stories start, you know?
Yeah. When you have that many people die or suffer or just waste away or whatever, you end up with some bad juju.
Yeah, it's more of like the multitude of people that have passed, you know? It's not just one over a bad cause, but it's the multiple people that have gone.
Yeah. And that's what makes it tough sometimes with these episodes that we do. When you have a lot of people that die in one location and a facility as haunted as this location is, our minds, it's really easy to wrap our minds around stories of like living people that we could point to that died there, that things happened to, and say, that's a ghost. Here's how they lived. Here's how they died. Here's how they live in their afterlife. This facility had so many deaths and so much suffering that just the air of the building when you go there, supposedly it is just overwhelming. And when you walk through certain rooms, you feel certain things. And that's what this facility is like. I have not been here. I have not been walked the grounds of this facility, so I don't know. But everything I've read basically says when people go here, they feel a heaviness, an understanding of the amount of suffering and death that took place here. So, all that said, let's get into some actual ghosts. I first want to talk about Civil War ghosts. So, the earliest use of the building, of course, was Civil War soldiers. And so it's said you can often feel the presence of these soldiers in the Civil War wing. In one area in particular, the presence of this era is mostly, I guess, through smells. So it's said that you can often smell like horses or stables. Guests will say, "Yeah, I smelled this horses. Where are the horses at?" And then it's like, "Oh, those were ghost smells." And one of the stories I found, it comes from Brake's book. It's really interesting because they talk about these visitors to the asylum and they smell these horses. And this one lady, she feels this presence of a soldier, and she's like, "Yeah, I don't know what it is, but his foot, something's wrong with his foot." And then all of a sudden, they smell this overwhelming smell of like an old wound. And I thought of like gangrene or something like that. But like as fast as it came, it went away. But that's just like a story after story of people smelling a lot of weird smells in this area. A lot of it's like horses and stuff, but some of it's soldiers. And it's often said that in this wing, it's not super uncommon to hear like moans from dying soldiers, even like heavy boots marching down the corridor. Apparently, the Civil War era soldiers are in abundance here.
You know what's funny is like I have a really bad sense of smell. So I'd probably walk through here and be like, "Oh yeah, there's nothing here." And everybody else like smelling like, "Man, these horses stink." And I'm just like, "Well, I don't smell anything." And then I start hearing stuff. Like my hearing, I feel like is actually pretty good. So I'd be like,
Yeah.
"Does anybody else hear that?" Like,
You hear the horses neighing, but you don't smell the horses pooping.
yeah.
Yeah. You hear the soldiers, you don't smell them. But apparently people smell them. So we'll go there with someone with a super smeller and see if they can smell anything.
I mean, that said, gangrene, man, that gangrene smells really, really bad. So that I feel like it would be hard for me to miss. I'd probably catch that.
Very difficult to miss the smell of a gangrenous foot. Yeah, that would be gross. So, probably the most well known ghost on site is that of Little Lily. So, she's one of the asylum's oldest ghosts. Her mother, Gladys, was sent to the asylum after being raped by Civil War soldiers. She had rightfully started losing her mind and went to the asylum. While she was there, she gave birth to Lily, but she actually ends up dying in childbirth. So, Lily stays at the asylum being cared for by the nurses and until her untimely death of pneumonia when she's still a little kid. So now today, when you visit her room, there are toys and candy left in her honor. The weird thing is that the staff claim to hear child's voices of laughter and noises, and that the toys in this room seem to kind of just move on their own. Sometimes when candy is left there, they'll come back and find that the candy is missing.
No, this would be the one room that I think I'd stay away from. Like, I don't care how nice Lily is. I don't want to visit Lily.
Yeah, something about like benevolent ghosts. When ghosts aren't evil, you're like even more scared of them because you're like, you shouldn't be here. There's a weird, yeah, I get that. Little kid ghosts are scary. They can't all be Casper.
I wonder if, like, even today, like 2024, if there's still candy and toys left in her honor.
No, yeah, when you go there, there's toys and candy and stuff there. People, when they go, they bring toys and leave them in that room.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm really glad that this kid kind of gets a lot of respect because the terrible things that happened to her mother and the terrible things that this child had to go through, like I'm really happy that this kid still gets that respect, you know?
Yeah, it's like a double edged sword in a way. Like you like that someone's leaving toys and things in her honor, but at the same time it adds like a little eeriness to it, like you're leaving something for someone that's been gone for 150 years. It's creepy, but it's great that they're still honoring this poor girl that died there. So let's talk about Ruth. Like always, I have a lot of sources that I go through when I put these episodes together. Some sources say this ghost is in the Civil War wing, and others say she was in the geriatric wing or the geriatric ward. Either way, Ruth comes up again and again. Ruth is the spirit of a ghost of an older woman who is said to hate men. Over the course of her stay at Allegheny, Ruth was said to be extremely violent and set off by the presence of men. So now, if you're at Allegheny and you're a man, it's said that your presence could set her off. It could set off her anger, and she's often felt by men walking through the asylum.
All right, so I guess that you and me are not going to be visiting this place, or at least we're not going to visit Ruth's wing anytime soon, huh?
Yeah, this rules out you and I going, I think. I'm not trying to be tortured by some old lady ghost that hates men.
I wonder if like any males when males visit this wing, I wonder if they do you have any stories about that when males visit this wing? Do they feel anything or feel more fear?
So I don't have any specific stories, but I do know that when men visit this ward, the geriatric ward, supposedly they're more likely to feel the presence of Ruth than any of the ladies. So she has some type of hate for the presence of men. And so just being in this ward as a man, you're more likely to feel her presence as opposed to being a female here, I guess.
Just for once, I would like to walk into a building and feel like the ghosts want you there and they're just super nice to you and welcoming.
Yeah, that's why you go to Lily's room because she wants to play with you.
Yeah, no. I'm sorry, Lily.
That's even scarier. You're like, you know what? I'm just gonna go. So, in an area referred to as the back room, there were three men: Dean, Big Jim, and David Mason. So, they were violent criminals. And when people in West Virginia were sent away as criminally insane, they oftentimes ended up here at this asylum. So, they had their own room, and Big Jim, David Mason, they were paired with Dean. Supposedly, Dean was like a childlike person, mostly docile, but he'd have these like random bursts of violence. So he was kept away from the regular patients. The story goes that Big Jim and David Mason, they would just torture Dean. They often tied a bedsheet around his neck and they would hang him from the rafters. He'd eventually pass out and then they'd let him down again. He'd regain consciousness and they'd do it again. One night, they held him down. They placed the wrought iron foot of the bed on his head and they jumped on it until he died. So that's a very gruesome death. But when you have deaths like this, you oftentimes have spirits or echoes or something from events like this. And that's exactly what we get. So the Travel Channel episode I talked about earlier, they bring in this psychic. She's blindfolded. She's able to get a read on a man that's childlike, that's lying on the floor looking up, being murdered. So some say you can feel a benevolent ghost that eventually runs away and is replaced by malicious ghosts, presumably the ghosts of Big Jim and David Mason.
This kind of makes me picture of like Sling Blade, where you got this innocent guy who's just gone through a lot of issues in life and still gets like abused by people just because he's mentally ill. They take him and abuse him.
Yeah, it's pretty sad because there's a lot of this in this era, and even today, mental health is so tough for people. It's hard to be around people that you wouldn't consider normal. And a lot of these patients that need a little bit of extra help that are childlike, they often fall through the cracks or get abused. And then this specific case, this was a situation where these violent criminals, they had some overcrowding, they didn't have room for everybody. They stick these guys in the same room as this guy Dean, who could be violent, but was mostly childlike and nice and good. And because they put him in a room with two other violent criminals, he gets essentially beaten to death.
Wow, that's so sad. I mean, no wonder there's some evilness here.
Yeah, and this is a common ghost. People oftentimes say they see like pairs of shadows. Psychics say they feel the presence, these two malicious people right next to like a docile, kind of good intentioned spirit. So this is a very common thing that happens here at Trans-Allegheny. People sense these ghosts often, and this is a very, very famous set of ghosts that appear very frequently, I guess. I have a couple more things I want to talk about ghost wise before we start wrapping up. So the upper floor is host to, I guess, multiple evil spirits, one of which has a terrible reputation of murder and treachery. This ghost is named Slewfoot. It's said to roam this area. And when you're here, it's said that you feel the presence of Slewfoot. And people claim to hear disembodied voices and they see shadows moving down the halls. And this being, or whatever it is on the upper floor, very evil presence, is called Slewfoot. It's its own ghost. It does its own thing. There was not a whole lot of like definitive history on who this might be, but this creature, this thing, comes up again and again when people visit the upper floor of this hospital. They feel the presence of Slewfoot.
So, do they feel like Slewfoot is like you said? They do feel like he's an evil spirit.
Yeah, he's some kind of evil spirit that roams the halls up there, but there's no definitive link to a person or a living thing or history that happened here. It's just that it's a creature of something that roams the halls.
Interesting. You see, this is like situations where I think like there's so much evil in one area that a demon can kind of manifest.
You wonder if when there's a lot of evil in the location, if either A, it's because there was some kind of presence there before that has always been there, or B, when there's a lot of bad things happening in one location, it draws in evil spirits or evil things. Either this presence has always been here and that's why bad things happen, or bad things happen, therefore this thing comes and shows up.
Yeah, I mean, Indians already said that this is an area that had a lot of evil around it. You know, they obviously didn't want to set up camp here. They didn't want to be around here for very long. So I mean, obviously there was evil here to begin with. Slewfoot could have been something that was already there, and he just got stronger and stronger through the evil that appeared in this place.
Yeah. Slewfoot kind of makes me think of like the screw tape letters, like screw tape. The name feels like that of some type of evil spirit, like a demon or something. And the Native Americans, I know we talked about they were here before and they felt evil spirits here. Maybe it's whatever was there previously and it's just lingered forever and ever.
How did you just compare screw tape letters to Slewfoot?
Screw tape and Slewfoot just kind of sound like demons, names of demons. I don't know.
Screw tape letters is like biblical. It's like the Bible that was found in a cave.
Well, Screw Tape is a demon that writes to his nephew Wormwood.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought the screw tape letters were something found in a cave that was like the original biblical documents.
No, that was the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right.
The Screw Tape Letters was a book by C.S. Lewis about a demon writing letters to his nephew Wormwood.
Wow, I need to read this.
It's been a long time, but it's basically Screw Tape is writing letters to Wormwood, but he's basically instructing him on how to lead Christians astray. That's the whole premise of the book. Okay, we're not just talking about evil spirits. Of course, we talked about Lily, that is a child and wasn't evil. There's also Nurse Elizabeth. So she's a ghost of a nurse that supposedly treated TB patients. Now, I assume that since she's a ghost at the asylum, that she died there. I'm not really sure. There's not a whole lot of information around it, but you oftentimes feel like we talked about Alcatraz. There was a nurse that died there. We talked about the reformatory, the Ohio State Reformatory. There was a nurse that roams the library there. It always seems like these places that had a lot of suffering and death, that had medical treatment, such as nurses, one or two nurses stick around and they still make their rounds. So there is a ghost named Nurse Elizabeth that roams around, and it's a presence that isn't evil like Slewfoot, but it's a presence that supposedly is trying to do good at this asylum.
So what you're saying is that I need to change profession.
Yeah, just don't die at the hospital, and if you do, I'll come visit you.
You're like, in today's podcast, Jason the Ghost. We've got a microphone here for him.
Yeah, I have a mic set up at the hospital, and I got some EVPs that I believe is Jason, and we're gonna work off these for our next episode.
It might be Jason. We're hoping that's something else.
We hope it's not Slewfoot, but we think it's Jason. We're not sure.
We need to come up with like a code word or something.
Yeah, we should do that. We probably shouldn't do that, but maybe we should. If you die or I die, we should come back and be like, I don't know. We'll come up with something.
You act like I'm gonna come looking for your ghost. That's hilarious.
I'm coming for yours. I need the password. What is the password, Jason? If you're here, tell me the password. Gosh. All right. I think we're kind of starting to overstay our welcome. We're coming to the end of the episode here. The last thing I do want to talk about is, and it's not really any easy way to discuss this, but it's the overall atmosphere of this place. A lot of times when we talk about places that had a lot of evil or torture or death, it's less about the stories themselves and more about the atmosphere that either A, creates these ghosts, or B, is created by the evil in these locations. And it's really hard to pin stuff like this down. When you talk about really haunted places, you talk about feelings, you talk about emotions, you talk about smells. Yeah, there's a history. Yeah, sometimes you can point to specific ghosts. But in this case, in the asylum, and other cases that we've talked about, I think it's more than that. When you have disembodied voices, clanging noises, smells, footsteps, presences felt behind you, shadows kind of going across the hallway, it's hard to pinpoint the history of why those are happening. But often they occur in places where there's a lot of pain, a lot of sorrow. And one thing that we didn't really talk about was, I guess sometimes people that come here, they'll see mists or fog or like like I guess shadowy stuff in the halls. And sometimes this could be said that it's I guess there was several fires that happened. There was a guy that set multiple fires, and was eventually caught by bloodhounds. He was a pyromaniac. So maybe that fog or mist is the smoke from the fire. But there's all this evil that's churned here that's been here for a long time, and it's created like a choking feeling of presences of evil. A lot happening here, and it's hard to explain in a podcast or an episode because you want to build it on top of actual historical evidence, but we just don't have we do have a lot of it, but some of these things we don't. And I want to figure out a way to talk about that, because how do you talk about a place that's super super haunted and has all these things happening in it without experiencing it yourself?
And I think that's where we kind of just bring the attention to the area, you know? You know, we can't obviously put people anybody we can't force people to go here, but we can at least say, "Hey, there's something strange happening here," you know? It's an interesting site to visit. And I think the number of people that visit here and say, "Yeah, there's something here," that speaks volumes in itself, you know?
Yeah, definitely. People have felt a lot of things here, and that does speak volumes. So this place is undoubtedly haunted. It's safe to say that places like this have seen so much death and misery and collected so many souls. It's rightfully earned its name as one of the most haunted mental health facilities in the US.